back again with a video I've been sort of alluding to for a number of weeks now, talking about the moths, etc. that show up here on the porch. And so remember in a previous video I talked about maybe the most simple passive way of getting observations, sort of a slow build type of thing, just seeing what happens to show up at your house, in my case on my porch, on any given day when I happen to be doing pretty much anything else, right? So just kind of being vaguely available to what happens to show up. This time we're going to step it up just slightly and take a bit more of an active approach, looking at specifically trying to bring in species to this setting, and to trying to on any given night document all the different species that show up. And so this is not something I do on a nightly basis all the time. It's actually something I've done more frequently out kind of on the countryside, but I wanted to try it out here in the city. One, because I was curious, two, because it's what's available to me. I'm not spending the same amount of time in the field considering what's going on in the world. And I'll tell you, I was pleasantly surprised with what I saw. So in the video ahead, what I've done is kind of make it focused on the results that I got. I do a small sampling of some of the most interesting, unique species, at least to me, that I've seen. Many of them are technically pretty common in the southeastern United States, according to the field guide, but in my experience, I was the first time, or at the very least for the first time in the city. And so I want you to see that, maybe get some I guess by extension, appreciation and excitement about what I'm seeing, and maybe spark some curiosity about what you might have just kind of waiting right outside your door. And so the video is mostly focused on the results. It took me a little bit of time because I originally took the opposite approach and focused on the process out here. But as you're going to see, it's very, very simple. And I think it would have insulted your intelligence to kind of put it forth that way. So instead, by kind of flipping it, I'll interject with the process. And certainly that's going to be a thread throughout the video. But really, I take more time here to focus on what I actually saw and what was interesting about the bugs that showed up on the porch, particularly on this video focusing on moths. All right, I hope you enjoy. Bringing in bugs is relatively straightforward. If you just flip a light on at night, just something that will kind of grab their attention as flying by. And while this generally works and is true, I've always kind of assumed in the city that I wasn't going to have success because there's so much light around, right? There's a lot of light pollution in the city. I've lived in San Antonio. We've had this sort of 70 square foot back porch for a year and a half now. And so for all the different observations I've made, including hundreds of moths, I never really made any dedicated effort out here on the porch in the city, just for on the assumption that I wasn't going to have much luck. But on the night of April 19th, I decided I'd give it a shot. We've been quarantined for a couple months now, and so I don't get the same opportunities out in the field and out of the field station that I normally would. So I flipped the overhead light on, and I added a supplemental light. I shined at a sheet in the corner of the porch just to try to get just a little bit extra, maybe to grab the attention of some species that were flying by. And on that first night, it was kind of cool because I found an insect that I wasn't expecting to see in the city. It wasn't the first I'd ever seen. I'd seen a couple in the past, but the fractured western snout, one I had seen out at the field station when I set up, actually showed up on this night. And so I wasn't necessarily surprised to see any species that I had seen in the past, but I was surprised to see one like this that I'd only seen a couple times in the past. I was expecting to see sort of nondescript beetles and pug moths, just species that are extremely common. In my experience in the past, this was not an extremely common species. And as it turned out, this is the only one I saw for that whole week. And so I just happened to catch this one at the right time. And in total, this first night, even though this was theoretically a mothing effort, I ended up finding more non-moths, so other insects, rather than rather than moths this time. And so there were 14 moths, but 20 that were not. Most of those were insects, and in fact, there was one house gecko, I believe, on the first night. So if it'll let me get close to him. A little house gecko up there. Oh. Yeah, he's not thrilled with me. But for a total of 34 species. So 34 species in one evening, not spending a whole heck of a lot of time out on the porch, just setting the light on and coming out late in the evening to see what has happened to show up for the few hours that I had the light on. And so mostly passive, just a quick effort to kind of go and collect the observations for the species that happen to show up. And so on night 2, I ended up doing what I had intended to do in the first place. So I had technical difficulties with a UV black light the first night. And I got it to work the second night. So I left the overhead light on, but ended up setting up a supplemental black light instead. And so it's not very well understood why some insects are more attracted to black lights, to UV light, but and there are theories relating to their reliance on the moon for navigation, and even a sort of pheromone connection, that it has some sort of similar stimulation to pheromones. For whatever reason, though, there are some species that are going to be a little bit more attracted to that. And I'm looking at, again, the sort of light pollution is all sort of general broad spectrum light. This is a little bit more specific. It's something at least different that might bring in some new bugs. And so I tried that on the second night. And I saw the first and only bent line carpet moth I've ever seen. I also saw the first forest tent caterpillar moth I'd ever seen, which incidentally to me looks like a Muppet with wings. This one, or maybe a couple of its cronies, were hanging around a little bit later in the week as well. And so there you go, 2 new species that I wasn't expecting among many, many species all in one night. And it seems to have brought in quite a bit of business. How much we attribute to the bulb versus the weather versus the... I don't know. Total of 55 on the porch, slight lean toward the moths versus the non-moths. But that's a big number for a small porch in the city at night, with, again, very little effort. So the third night, I just tried to alternate. I was thinking, okay, I'll go back and forth. But I was actually using a different fixture that exposed the bulbs. So I thought, okay, the supplemental light will be a little bit brighter. We'll give it a shot. And it was pretty weak. So what I have to say, though, is the light, this gives the impression that light's the only variable, but of course there are other things that go on as well, and so the weather was sort of a factor on this day. And so very weak turnout, and this was up through about 10:30 at night. Very weak and honestly kind of unacceptable. I knew there had to be more after having over 50 the night before. So a little after 10 o'clock, I popped in the black light again. So this is the same setup as the night before. And remember, the weather is a factor. Now I'm getting a late start with the black light, so I don't necessarily expect the same sort of results as the previous night. But second half of the night, with the black light, I ended up bringing in a dwarf tawny wave. So that was the first one I'd ever seen. I saw a second one maybe a week later, but still, in my experience, a relatively rare species. And so my numbers did rise quite a bit. I would say, I got the impression anyway that on this night, the UV light kind of salvaged the night. And so it wasn't any sort of miracle, but it seemed to help quite a bit, bringing in an extra 20 observations. And so if you think about it, that's over the last maybe 2 hours of the night. That's about a new species every 5 to 6 minutes on this small porch. So on the fourth night, I decided I kind of like what's happening with the UV light, but I still feel like it's kind of a wash with light pollution all around it, and that's including my overhead light.
And so I decided to turn off the overhead porch light for this fourth night. I only turned it on right as I was about to step outside, just so I could better see what had shown up. But otherwise, for the amount of time that I was actually trying to lure species in, it was strictly the supplemental UV light, no overhead light. And wouldn't you know, I got a new species. So this was my first little nymph underwing moth. There was actually another species, the girlfriend underwing moth, that ended up showing up outside the scope of this little study more than a week later. But notice the orange marking on its hind wings. So that's just a hint of what really is going on there. It's actually very showy, those hind wings. And so a relatively spectacular species. And as it turns out, this individual was just a little bit more showy than average as well. And so again, you kind of think moths are relatively bland and look similar to each other, but even within a species, there is individual variation. And so that's kind of cool. We've seen that in other species too. It's more obvious, maybe in birds or mammals, but the moths are showing this as well. And so I wasn't aware. It was the first little nymph underwing I'd ever seen, but one of the identifiers, a more experienced person, commented on how kind of striking the white was on the wings of this moth. And you can see on later nights when I saw this species again, that it is quite a bit different. And so I think what we're looking at probably are 3 different individuals here, showing variation within the same species. I also saw a horned spanworm moth, and that's the first one I ever saw. Kind of an earthy, elegant little moth. Like, it kind of looks like a bleached oak leaf or something. And I was just kind of surprised to see this. I hadn't seen a moth at all like this. And again, if they all still kind of look the same to you, the more you look, the more you notice these little finite differences. And to me, this is sort of a big difference. And then there's yet another new species on the porch that same night, that fourth night. So a third lifeless species. And that's, again, I think thanks to that one bulb and kind of getting rid of the diluting light around it, certainly a little bit of luck. And really the key, and what I would kind of preach to you, is the wherewithal to look, right? The effort. Didn't take much. But this is a 4-spotted palpita moth, and it's unlike anything I expected to see. And I think you can probably see why. Certainly you can notice that there's quite a bit different sort of shape and coloration and just vibe about this species. And he actually came back the following night. And so I guess I've been in the habit of kind of naming the critters that come and go frequently from the porch. I haven't named him yet. But the funny thing is, even though there were 3 unique species, or 3 new species to me on the porch that night, it was a relatively low count for observations, right? Partly because there weren't a lot total. I think partly because I did kind of dim the porch, really, overall. And also because I wasn't necessarily trying to stack up repeat observations. And so you see a normal sort of trailing off just in the way that I personally approach iNaturalist. I'm not going for a bunch of the same species in one night or in successive days. I usually have sort of a vague feel for how long I take before I'll post the same species again. However, the next 4 nights were meant to be a BioBlitz, the City Nature Challenge. And so that's happening in cities across the world, including San Antonio. And so that's the local one that I was contributing to. And so in a BioBlitz, you generally try to get all the different species that you can. And in the past, this has been a competition. This year, in light of the pandemic, that tone was sort of dialed back a little bit. But for me, at a distance, in a very safe way, from my porch, I was able to collect just as many things as I could, whatever I could bring in. And so those next 4 nights, those I've highlighted the numbers in yellow, those are the nights that we're all contributing to the City Nature Challenge. Quickly here from the homepage, by way of review, if you want to find your projects, you can go here, or if you've already been part of a project and joined it, then you'll see it down here. But otherwise, if you're looking for this coming from the outside, wow, first try. So you type in basically the title of the project, and you'll find your way to it. And so the projects are, of course, interesting because they set confines for space. So you can see this is the San Antonio area. You can't see, but San Antonio's under there. And also for time. So this was the 4-day stretch, the last 4 days that this video is focused on. And it's really, in that way, as a glorified filter. So on the heels of what I considered a victory on night 4, I decided to stick with that same approach. Just the UV light, no overhead light throughout the City Nature Challenge. That's the beauty of using iNaturalist and of mothing and of my many other hobbies, is you can determine your own criteria for success. For me, it was not necessarily finding more species or finding more observations, but finding newer ones, more unique ones, trying to find some things I hadn't seen in the past. And really, if you think about it, that's almost the perfect mix, because you're actually able to enjoy the experience of, in my case, mothing more, and spending less time going through the same identifications of the same species over and over again, spending all that computer time and that time doing documentation. Let's look at night 5. I felt pretty good about this night. So the white-lined sphinx is probably one of my new favorite species. I've seen it around a little bit, but never in the city. So not my first observation. But here he was hanging from the sheet I'd set up on the porch. Good buddy. It actually wasn't the first one, like I said, but I'd seen it in different contexts. So I'd seen it spread wing, feeding out in the field. Here it is feeding on a thistle. And then prior to that, I'd actually seen it at work at a deer check station, just kind of slinking along in caterpillar form under the check station. And then what also makes this kind of cool, for better or honestly probably worse, is that it's featured on the cover of National Geographic this month. Unfortunately, it has to be in the context of how we're losing pollinators and losing moths. And that's at least to the extent that I can infer, because of course it's behind a paywall. So thank you, Apple News. And so what I know from this, quote unquote, insects are disappearing at alarming rates. That could be disastrous for the planet. You think? But this species has an extraordinary long tongue, so maybe it'll be all right. Very specialized, very interesting species. Or of course, maybe we could do something to help. I don't know. Anyway, that was the best species that I personally felt showed up on the porch that next night. And again, a relatively low number overall, but a pretty interesting turnout, and skewed much more toward the moths this time. So the next night, I stuck with that same approach, of course, and I brought in a green broomweed looper moth, which, look at that, that's a very different sort of wing arrangement. It sits very differently than the other species, and it's a cool-looking bug. It's a good-looking bug. And so, sort of like the white-lined sphinx moth that I had seen the night before, though, this was actually the third I had seen, but first one in the city. It wins the night, but it's a relatively busy Saturday night, right? So I more than doubled the turnout from the night before, and even from the night before that. So onward, night 7. I saw a Panaria wave for the first time. First one and the only one I've seen so far. And so it took 7 nights for it to show up, never showed up again. But again, that's kind of the beauty of just sort of casting that net, or in this case, casting that light on a fairly regular basis, just to kind of see, because you never know what happens to be, flying by and will notice that light on a given night. I also saw the Glover's bagworm moth for the first time, and that's it there to the right of center. You notice that's not a moth, that's a plant bug next to it. This was, again, a week into the project, but as it turned out, I would see this species multiple times over the nights that followed. Decent turnout, 28 bugs that night, mostly moths, but you can see it. This is really adding up, and there's still one more night for the Nature Challenge. Expecting a strong finish. Not sure what you expect. But it was also, as it turned out, a garbage weather sort of day. It wasn't a total bust for the moths. This is a rascal dart. It's the first one I'd ever seen, so again, another one for the life list. And it's, again, one I haven't seen since. So very fleeting. But it ended up being a weeknight overall. as numbers go. It was kind of tied for the lowest night. But it's cool to be able to add that eighth night still another new species to my list. Over the whole course of things, brought in 241 observations over the week. 109 of those actually contributing to the City Nature Challenge. And this is strictly what's out on the porch, right? So this is just out in the evening, going out, maybe 8 o'clock and setting up a light, coming back between 11 and 12, and spending, 15 minutes just trying to see what all's out here and get a good picture of each thing. So that's a relatively low investment, super easy, super cheap. And again, it doesn't account for the other observations I might get if we go out for a walk, take the baby out in the stroller and whatever sorts of bugs or wildflowers might be coming up along the roadside, or the walks that we'll take, or hikes that we'll take in the city parks. There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of ways to get different types of observations and different experiences. And this is just maybe something that can elevate what otherwise would be a kind of quiet evening at home. So over that time, there were more than 11,000 observations brought in by more than 600 observers, a total of 1,891 species, at least to this point. So there might be some observations that were not identified down to genus or down to species to the point where they could be research grade. That all kind of comes with time, and so sometimes this number will change a bit, or somebody could have lagged and will end up adding observations later. So it's going to be probably at least these numbers, if not more. And you can still take your grid view and still take your list view if you want to. And so, of course, I guess it's only fair, a quick shout out, especially to the identifiers. All right, so look how much some folks have gotten on and sort of cover this. And a few of these folks have been the same that were out getting observations as well. So lots of work put in there. And then a lot of observers. Shout out Craig. And Amphirepeated Joseph. Looks like they tied for the most observations. That's pretty sweet. I eked in just barely to the top 10, but I guess a shout out as well. I remember looking through and seeing that a few of these folks, this was maybe half of the observations they've ever gotten was in this long weekend. And so that's pretty awesome to have somebody who's not done thousands of observations in the past to kind of jump in headfirst to a weekend BioBlitz like this. Well done. So I'll leave this here just so you can appreciate it for a few seconds, the variety of the different moths that I saw. And so, no, of course, it's not a huge variation in color, but look at some of the other variables that are going on, the different types of lines or spots, the sort of different tones in color. So even though it's mostly browns and grays and orange, there are different tonal qualities to it. In some cases, you can't really get from a picture like this, but there will be some different sorts of, not luminescence, but shimmer to the wings of some of these moths. And certainly just look at the different shapes and get a sense for the different sizes. So something like the Sphinx moth is going to be huge compared to something like the breamweed moth. Keep in mind this is a small sampling. So this is a sample of just 12 of the different species of over 200 that I saw over the course of this week. And to put it in perspective, what should be a relatively, you would think, low reward environment, a small porch in the city. I had documented over 130 moth species, mostly in central Texas before this, and yet here we have a dozen more that I wasn't expecting to see, which is pretty cool. Just a quick put in perspective, I know that, yes, I said it's on the easy end of things, but it still is a lot of work to get all these observations and to kind of curate them. Bear in mind, that's not necessarily what I do every single night. Obviously, I put in quite a bit more effort than what I normally would do. And so just keep that in mind, that, I'm trying to show you sort of a blitz, but, life works differently than that. And it's not, I don't necessarily think that was going to be sustainable for me, but it's kind of a cool thing to do. And if you do the sort of passive observations, then they do add up over time. You can see that there weren't any huge days really in especially January and February, but I still had amassed over 100 species in that time.
Okay, hope you found that interesting. I know it was detailed, but it certainly wasn't complicated. Again, that's kind of why I ended up flipping the layout of the video, because taking a lot of time to show you the setup almost would insult your intelligence, wouldn't it? Right? It didn't seem that deep. But hopefully, in looking at the examples and getting at least some feel for my restrained interest and excitement about what I was seeing on the porch, maybe you'll be inspired to do something similar. And that doesn't necessarily mean trying to get 200 observations in a week. It doesn't mean doing a bio blitz. It doesn't mean documenting every single thing that comes out on the porch. It doesn't mean buying a black light and hanging a sheet. It could mean any of those things, or it could mean some sort of fraction of any of those things. But I hope it at least gives you some curiosity about what is actually available to you without actually having to leave your house. And I think it'd be great if you just took some time, went and had a look, right, and incrementally work up to it. Flip the light on. If you start seeing things that kind of interest you and you wonder what else is there, then start trying to maybe bring in other species and making it more of an occasional thing, or maybe a routine. I think that there's going to be some surprises for you, just as there were for me, and realize that this isn't something I've done for a tremendously long time. I had no frame of reference, but as I've gone along, I just keep seeing new, different species, and that's something that doesn't necessarily happen on your 10th, 15th hike. After a while, you've seen pretty much all the birds you're going to see until you start learning calls, right? So there's always going to be a second level where you start seeing, in a short period of time, you start seeing pretty much all the different wildflowers that are going to bloom for the time being, until later in the season or the next season. And so what I've noticed is, at least here in Texas, year-round, there is going to be something that's showing up on the porch. And it doesn't have to take a whole lot of involvement and a lot of effort. And so hopefully you have some other experiences with it. You have some things you could share in the comments. And certainly I'd love to see on iNaturalist some folks, just kind of taking the low-hanging fruit, taking the easy observations, because there still is a lot to be gained from that. And certainly we're building our sort of Rolodex of species that way as well. All right, so hope to see you in the comments. Hope to see you on iNaturalist. We'll be back in future videos with, again, incrementally more complicated approaches to getting observations and connecting with nature. Till next time.